Okay, I have a question for you. War! What is it good for? That's what we're going to be talking about today. Wars and the American economy. So our bottom line is that wars harm people and economies. And we kind of knew that. So we are going to start by looking at some numbers. So our first table is looking at the total number of, well, first, for each one of the wars, population of the country at the start of the war, the number of military personnel that are involved, and then as a percentage of the population, and then the total fatalities and how large that is as a percentage of the population. And that'll give you a little bit of sense of the size of each one of these wars, and there may or may not be some surprises. I took most of these from historical statistics, but supplemented them with some other sources, and there's some little notes down at the bottom about some of the measurement problems we have, especially with some of the earlier wars, so, and including the Civil War. And so by looking at this, I think the things that stand out are that in terms of total military personnel involved, the two wars that really stand out are, of course, the Civil War and World War II, although the Revolutionary War, not as many absolute number of soldiers, but a fairly large fraction of the population involved. The Civil War really stands out when it comes down to the death and destruction, though, in terms of the total fatalities. And look down at the notes, they may be even larger than that. Now, Table 2 puts things into more economic terms for each one of the wars. We're going to look at the direct costs of the war. That's, how much money is being spent, checks written out by the government to fund the war effort. And then converting all of those dollars from their dollars, which is the first column, into more recent dollars, dollars from just a few years ago, which are pretty similar to today's dollars. And then putting those things into per capita terms. And then looking at the cost of the war in the last column, if we add up the cost of the war over all the years that it ran, how big was that in comparison to the size of their economy at that time? And again, the Civil War and World War II really stand out. The Civil War combined cost more than 1 year's worth of the entire output of the entire economies north and south, and of course, World War II added up to more than 100% of 1 year's worth of total production of final goods and services for the entire. Now let's flip over to the next sheet. And we spend a lot of money on war, military-related things, even when we're not in a shooting war. So Table 3 looks at military spending as a percentage of GNP. GDP would be pretty similar. And so the interesting pattern here, of course, this picks up the late 1800s. The interesting pattern is that, especially after World War II, where the numbers get to their highest level ever, close to a third of all the final goods and services going into the war effort. The numbers come back down a little bit at the end of the war, a lot at the end of the war. Then with Korea, they jump back up. And look, they stay high even in the not hot part of the Cold War. So when my dad was in the military in the early 60s, before the Vietnam era, we were actually spending more money, percentage of GDP, on military from 54 to 63 than we were during the Vietnam War itself. So that's kind of a surprise. Then when that war ended, the numbers started to come down, especially when the Cold War ended. You see the numbers coming down a decent bit. And then when, after 9/11, the numbers have come back up a little bit. But there's kind of this is a good thing, I think, a clear downward trend during the last half century or so. Yes, so this is not as a percentage of government spending. This is as a percentage of GDP. And in absolute values, the numbers generally haven't come down, but of course the economy grows. So as a percentage of GDP, it's shrinking. So let me point out that the numbers we've just seen, official statistics from the government, can, especially in wartime, leave out a lot of additional costs. So one thing they leave out, and we're going to focus on, especially during the Civil War, because I think the things that were left out would be the biggest during the Civil War. One thing they leave out is the destruction that the war, just wreaks on the entire economy. If the fighting is somewhere else, okay, the destruction to our economy is good. But if it's here, which the Civil War was, it'll be much bigger. So now move over to Table 4, and this adds on, as it says, additional cost of the Civil War. And these are all in millions of $1860 in the same unit. We've got things for the South. We've got them for the North. And there's our estimates of the physical destruction. They have nothing in for the North, and there would have been some physical destruction. That number shouldn't literally be zero, but it's pretty low. The physical destruction in the South, though, is huge, right? We're talking $1.5 billion of their dollars. What else needs to be added in? Well, what about the loss of not physical capital, but human capital? One way to measure that, the way that Roger Ransom uses in this table, is to look at the value of the output lost due to deaths and injuries. You got this 20-year-old kid who's probably going to live to be, I don't know exactly what the life expectancy of a 20-year-old was then, but let's say 65. During the course of his life, he was going to be working on the farm, working somewhere and producing stuff. And so that gets subtracted out. Or if he had to have his leg amputated, okay? Well, he's working, but he's not anywhere near as productive as he would have been had the war not occurred. We'd have to subtract that out. And that's the next line down in Table 4 here, the loss of that human capital. And notice that it adds up to greater than the loss of that physical capital. So physical capital, I come in and I burn down your farm or tear up your railroad or blow up your building or whatever. The loss of the human capital in terms of foregone output is even bigger. Now there's another way that economists measure kind of damages due to people getting injured and dying. So this is an alternative way to measure the same thing. I might not be very productive, but somebody might value my life a lot. And so what economists do is they estimate something called the value of a statistical life. And this is very widely used these days in various government projects. Should we straighten out this highway a little bit? We straighten it out, there'll be fewer crashes. It'll be really expensive to straighten it out. How many crashes are we going to, offset? How many people would have died in those crashes? We've got to weigh those things against each other. So we have to put things in the same metric, which is dollars, because that's what we're spending to straighten out the highway. So how can we put the value of a human life into dollar terms, crass as that sounds? What we do is we look at how people show us they value their own lives. You've got two different job offers. Right? One is at a perfectly safe job. Another one is at a more dangerous job. They're going to have to pay you more to work the dangerous jobs. How much more? So we can see, if we've got 1,000 people who go into this more dangerous job, on average, one of them will die during the course of a year. Well, how much extra do we have to pay those people? Add up the extra amount we have to pay them to get them to lose one of their lives by 1,000 of them going into the more dangerous job. That's essentially what we do, so that people are collectively putting the value on their own lives. If we had to pay those 1,000 people $1 million extra to work in that job, and then one of them dies on average, they're showing us that they value their lives collectively at $1 million. So that's kind of the method that we use. And what we find is that over time, the amount you got to pay people to work in those dangerous jobs or do other things dangerous, like drive more dangerous cars or whatever, gets higher and higher. Because as we get richer and richer, we can afford to value our lives at a higher and higher amount. And we spend more and more for safety. Back in the old days, guys dying in coal mines and stuff, it's not because they were stupid, it's because they were poor. And they couldn't afford to value their lives very high. So what we can do is kind of look at the trend in this, project it back to the Civil War, and see about how much they were placing. And so the calculation I've got there is in today's dollars, they were valuing their lives about $300,000. We would value our own lives by the same metric, $5 to $10 million. So a lot more because we're richer. So let's put that calculation in with the number of people who died, got injured, etc. And what's interesting is that's what I've done kind of in the italicized font there. It comes out to be very similar to the calculation using the loss of human capital on the earlier line. So what are we doing? We're looking at the cost of war. We started with some direct estimates from the government, how much they had to actually spend, and now we're adding some things in that they left out. But another cost we need to add in. What about the cost after the war when we give you some extra benefits for having fought in the war, like pensions, or especially in early wars, they didn't give you a pension, but they gave you a land grant. And so you could either move out to the frontier where this land was or sell this off to somebody else. Nowadays, of course, healthcare expenses, etc. And these pensions can last for a long time. There was a story in the Wall Street Journal earlier this year about Irene Triplett, a North Carolinian. Her father fought in the Civil War. So when he was a really old guy in the 30s or so, some young poor woman married him so that she could get some of his pension money, right? And she, as his orphan, I guess, gets a check to this day. That war ended 150 years ago, and she still gets a check. Okay? So these can play out over a long, long period of time. Wow. Yeah. And so what do we got down here? The next line on our table is pensions. You can see for the South, they're not that high. State governments gave some out after the Civil War. And then for the North, they're not anywhere near as big as the physical destruction, but they are hundreds of millions of dollars. And pensions peaked in terms of federal spending around 1895. 40% of federal government spending was spending on pensions, right? Middle of the 1890s. Okay. Now, next thing to add in, and this is getting even trickier, is lost consumption. Because war puts your economy through the ringer. If the war hadn't come along, you probably are going to be producing a lot more than when the war does come along. We do want to avoid double counting because we're paying these soldiers to go off and fight a war rather than produce things. And so I think we've already got that in because we're paying them. But what we want is just the whole economy contracting because of the war being fought, because of the uncertainty of the war, because of having to shift resources from one place to another very quickly, etc. And so we're getting a lot hazier here in how much the output is actually going down to the war because we can't run history multiple times to kind of see what's going on. And so this is a lot trickier, but Roger Ransom has got estimates of that. Indirect costs, the total decline of consumption, and this is bigger than any of the other things, especially in the South. But part of that now is because during the war, a lot of slaves are getting freed, and now they're not being forced to work so much, so we kind of have to, I think, subtract that out, right? And then there's changes in the price of cotton, things that weren't really due to the war itself. We're going to have to subtract those out. And I'm not sure if Roger Ransom has done his calculations perfectly, but after he makes his adjustments, you can see his bottom line numbers. This loss of consumption from the war, especially in the South, that is huge too. Now, there's other things you could add in that are not added in Roger Ransom's tables. Like during war, you've got to start raising money for the war effort, and so you start taxing everything. Anybody who teaches microeconomics knows that there's a dead weight loss triangle that comes in when you put a tax in place, right? And so there's those losses as well, and they're not in this table. So when we start adding all these things together, let's look at kind of the bottom line of this one. Additional total cost of the war, they're adding up to billions of their dollars. And you can see how much they're coming up to per capita. And in the South, boy, they just swamped what they were in the North. Okay, so flip over to Table 2 for a second. I see the combined direct cost. This is the first column. The combined cost of the Confederate and Union direct costs at about $5 billion in 1860 dollars, $5 billion, and we just added in all these indirect costs, and they look like they add up to about $7 billion. So they're even bigger than the direct costs. Now, the Civil War would have been an outlier in this case because obviously it was fought on our own turf, and that really adds to these things. But you could make a bunch of adjustments like that for other wars as well. Okay, so I think these are really useful numbers to have at your disposal for thinking about how costly these wars are. Okay. Now, step back a little bit. Let's think about economic causes of war. When we're deciding whether or not to go into a war, do we sit down as rational maximizers, like we would when we're deciding whether to buy a new car or not, and weigh off, well, what are the costs of this? What are the benefits of this? Okay, I think the answer is rarely, right? So, right, we do that in our day-to-day life, but what a politician's doing in deciding whether or not to vote yes for a war effort isn't really weighing expected economic costs versus expected economic benefits, but their own personal political costs versus their political benefits. Will this help me get reelected? Will this make my party more popular, etc.? And so they often have a strong incentive to downplay the costs as they're going into the war, the economic cost, and overstate the benefits, as they do with other government programs. They've got the same thing going on with the war. So war could, in some cases, be due to massive miscalculation. So, I don't know. Would the Civil War have been averted if policymakers had had an accurate grasp of all these costs we just added up? Lincoln's Secretary of Treasury estimated that the direct expenditures of that war were going to add up to only about $240 million, and they ended up being 13 times higher. Okay, that's a big order of magnitude. Now let's think about impacts that the war has on the economy in much greater detail. The first thing to think about is financing the war. There's a lot of different ways government can raise money. Each of them has their own strengths and weaknesses. The first thing that you do to raise money is taxation. Okay? Now, paying for a war entirely in taxes can be pretty difficult, okay? Because as expensive as they are, you might have to raise tax rates to such a high level that people just don't have an incentive to work hard or whatever, or they have a big incentive to cheat and not pay the taxes, whatever. And so war in many ways is kind of like a capital expenditure. If we're going to build a highway, we don't always have to pay for it right up front, but we can spread those costs over many years to come because the highway is going to be giving us benefits for years to come. Capital project like that. War is kind of like that. We fight the war, hopefully we win, and then in the future we will get a whole bunch of benefits from that. Future generations will benefit from this. They should have to pay some of the tab too. So for both those reasons, we're not going to rely entirely on taxes, but we're going to bump down to the next category, borrowing. Borrowing is, spend now, pay later. But what if you can't get anybody to lend you any money? What if you can't get people to pay their taxes? And what if you can't get people to lend you money because they don't think you'll be able to pay it off? That's especially what the Confederacy was in. So what do you do then? Then you have to start resorting, especially to just creating money. You print the money up. You say, this is legal tender. People have to accept it. Too bad. Right? And if even if that doesn't work, you can resort to, and you almost always do resort to, outright confiscation. That's what a draft is, after all. We say, you can't work for yourself anymore. You have to come work for us. That's what a draft is all about. But it also, in wartime, sometimes they'll just go in and confiscate supplies as well. Not just your enemies coming in confiscating your supplies, but, the Confederate Army would come through and say, hey, sorry, we just need horses, guys. Can't really pay you for them. We're taking them. Okay? So let's take a look at how the Civil War in particular is funded in terms of the first three of those categories. We don't have good information on the confiscation. And so you'll see in figure 3 here, the three categories. And first notice how the expenses are rising tremendously during the course of the war. But the Union at first is relying mainly on taxes. But then as the war really kicks into gear, they're borrowing more and more. They also, a lot is coming from just printing up the U.S. government notes. See the relative importance of those. And how it differs from the Confederacy. Confederacy, very small fraction of theirs is being raised by taxes. They just don't have a good infrastructure for squeezing taxes out of people. For one thing, they're under a Union blockade, and a big traditional source of taxes is tariffs, so they can't really collect many tariffs at all. But second, begin to rely on bonds. These are pretty risky, though. Who's going to lend money to this upstart government that, if they lose, won't be able to pay off their bond? And so they do float some loans over in Europe, really high interest rates. They kind of have some, if I understand right, a bunch of cotton in warehouses that they're using as collateral that's going to help pay off those. But obviously that starts to break down and doesn't get very credible. And so what they resort to for more than half of their funding is simply printing up a lot of money. Okay. What happens when you print up a lot of money? Too much money chasing too few goods causes inflation. And so a lot of counterfeiting will do the same thing. Actually, printing up money and just saying it's legal tender isn't that different than some guy down in his basement doing the same thing, right? And I know that the Union government encouraged, or at least turned a blind eye toward, an immense amount of counterfeiting that was done in the North of Confederate money. And then they would just ship it down south. And so that our money number that we're going to look at may be off by a little bit because of that. But ironically, it has the same effect of them printing up their own money or us printing up bogus money of yours. It's going to cause a lot of inflation. So the simple equation behind this is the quantity equation, quantity of money equation. And it says M, your money supply, times V, the velocity of the money, how rapidly it gets spent. M times V is going to equal P, your price level, times Y, your amount of real GDP. So normally we say when we're teaching this is that velocity is kind of constant and Y grows pretty slowly. And so if M goes up a lot, P's got to go up a lot. If your money supply goes up a lot, there's going to be a lot of inflation. During wartime, especially in the Confederacy, when they're printing up as much money as they did, that definitely breaks down because velocity also changes. When prices start to rise at hyperinflation levels, you're going to spend your money faster and faster and faster. If I hold on to it for a month, it'll have lost half of its value. So I'm going to run out and spend it. And so let's take a look at figure 5 down here. And this plots out two series. One is an index of prices in the South, and the other is an index of the money supply in the South. As you can see, for the first couple, 2 or 3 years of the war, they're rising pretty much in tandem. The more rapidly we increase our money supply, the more rapidly our prices go up. But then prices start to soar up way faster even than the amount of extra money that we're adding in. And that's after the crucial defeat at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, when it becomes pretty clear that this is not going to become an independent nation and this money is not going to be worth a heck of a lot anytime soon. And so people just try and spend it as fast as they can. There's a little lull after a while, and then, of course, it just takes off right as we get up toward Appomattox. Okay? So what happens when we have to resort to printing money to fund our war effort? It's going to unleash a lot of inflation. What happens when we're about to lose the war? That's going to unleash a lot of inflation as well, because this will no longer be legal tender at the end of the war. Now, because it's well known that increasing your money supply is going to cause inflation, quite often governments try to do things to hold that back. They put in place a lot of price controls. During World War II, they were very, very systematic about this. Efforts in other wars as well. So what this does is kind of bottles the inflation up a little bit. When those price controls are finally taken off at the end of the war, it's going to be a big burst of inflation then. but micros go into effect. They do a lot of things that distort the economy. So the price is controlled, and often that leads to rationing of a good. And so I can get this much at the official price, okay? But if I want to get anything else, I got to pay the black market rate, which is nowhere in our official statistics. And the black market rate is a lot higher than the official rate. So I get a little ration, let's say, for some gasoline. So maybe my first couple of gallons I can get at the market rate. But if I drive more than that and I need more gasoline, maybe I got to pay twice as much for it. And that's not showing up in our official statistics usually. And so they're giving you a lowball estimate of what the actual inflation rate is. You also know that the quality of goods starts to deteriorate. Well, I can't charge you a high enough price to cover my costs. Law won't let me. I'll make a good that costs less to produce. It'll be a shoddier good. It'll be a good of lower quality. And so you see a lot of that. Quality of products falls off, black market activity, rationing, and a lot of waiting in line and that kind of stuff to get your goods. And all of those costs are not shown up anywhere in our official statistics. Oh. So, question, does war stimulate the economy? And I think most economists will answer this question by saying rarely. Rarely. So, war can stimulate the economy if there's a lot of slack in the economy. So if there is slack in the economy, you can put these unemployed resources to work producing war effort at a very low opportunity cost. The classic guns versus butter trade-off. But the closer you are to full employment at the time of the war, the more the war material production is going to have to divert away from producing other things. And so adding on top of that, there's the famous brick through the window fallacy. Right? Some kid goes around town just throwing a bunch of bricks through people's windows. And then they got to hire the glazier to come in. Is that a good word? The glazier to come in and fix their windows. Money has been spent that was not spent otherwise. GDP has gone up. Okay? But of course, what that leaves out is that if the dude hadn't thrown the brick through my window, I would have spent my money on something else other than fixing my window, you know? And so hidden somewhere is that I didn't spend it in another category. Well, crowding out. And so in wartime, what do? We produce a lot of things that then later get blown up. Okay? We also produce a bunch of things that when the war is over are not valuable to us anymore. Like giant factories that were set up to produce this good, and gosh, we're just not going to be producing that good anymore. And maybe this really hit home to me once when I flew into Tucson, Arizona. Has anybody ever been to Tucson? There is a giant parking lot with thousands of airplanes just sitting there. They are surplus airplanes left over from World War II. They decided they would just park them there because it's such a great, desert, right? That they're not going to rust out or anything like that. And they're just sitting there and they've been there for decades, just sitting there. That's a monument to how we produce things that later were not useful for the economy. So I like this quote from Ludwig von Mises: war prosperity is kind of like the prosperity that an earthquake brings. Well, yeah, you're putting people to work, producing stuff, okay, but you destroyed a lot of value in the first place for them, and so your wealth is going to be going down, even if maybe the amount of goods and services you produce. I've noted a couple times that war does artificially inflate official GDP statistics because some of the inflation isn't being picked up there, and so we're using the wrong prices when we're making our adjustments, and we're making it look like GDP goes up by more than it actually does. But the father of American GDP, Simon Kuznets, he argued that war and defense should not be part of GDP. What is GDP? It's the market value of your final goods and services. Is war, is military stuff, a final good? He argued that it was an intermediate good. An intermediate good. It's something we produce that allows us then to produce other final goods and services that we actually like. Food and clothing and vacation trips and all that kind of stuff. So what counts as true prosperity? Kuznets argued that it's goods that go to consumption or investment to produce more consumption goods in the future, and most war goods do not fall into this category. Okay. So, on top of that, war creates a lot of uncertainty. It disrupts your normal business activity, and it puts people into jobs that they're really not best suited for. I was a skilled pipe fitter, and now I'm off digging trenches. That's not really what my human capital is designed for. So it's not so likely to make the economy very productive. So a couple days ago, when we were looking at those estimates of total factor productivity increase, remember the surge of productivity growth that kicked in when we started really applying electricity and the internal combustion engine to the economy, starting right at the end of World War I and lasting up until about 1970 or so. In the middle of that, there's a period where the total factor productivity growth fell, not all the way to zero, but well below what it had been. In the middle of that period was the period of World War II. Because what are we doing? We're taking our top scientists and engineers and whatever, and we're having them make very useful things, like the atomic bomb, to help us win the war. But that does not, translate much into being able to produce more final goods and services that give people the high standard of living. And so he finds a big drop-off by that diversion of talent in our total factor productivity. A lot of times you'll hear about cases during the war where they applied engineering skills, et cetera, to produce things way more efficiently. The Liberty ships are the classic case. They figured out how to make those ships like twice as fast as they did before, much lower labor costs by dividing up the tasks. They worked it out. Okay. Now, if that had been in the auto industry, we would have been able to keep running with that into the 50s, 60s, 70s. But it's in making these ships. And at the end of the war, we're not going to make any more of these ships. In fact, we're going to scrap a whole bunch of these ships. Do wars stimulate economies? And the bottom line here was rarely. Okay. And for a number of reasons, including that we're diverting our talent away to making technology that's good for the military, good for winning a war, but doesn't generally have perfectly direct applications to the civilian economy. Last thing in this section is that when we mobilize the troops, we're putting you away from being your pipe fitter to being a trench digger, right? And then we're demobilizing you, and you kind of have to readjust and get people back into their productive slots they were in before, and so you kind of put the economy through the ringer twice. So I will suggest that empirical evidence says every war has produced a decline in American well-being. Okay. Now, the Civil War, we can take a look at some clear numbers here, and this one is, I think, outside of room for debate. So let's look at Table 5, this is Table 5 over here. It's some estimates from ATAC and Purcell on real wages in the Union and in the Confederacy. Remember what real means? Real means that we're holding prices constant. Now prices went up, so we got to pull them back down and see what's happened to the purchasing power of the money you're earning. What we see in the North is that we'll define your purchasing power at the beginning of the war as 100, and then it declines during the war, hitting bottom in 1864, then starting to go back up. Okay, so real wages falling, not drastically, but add that up. Real wages falling 23%. What did they fall during the Great Depression? Right? The Great Depression saw the economy shrink by 25%. This is real wages shrinking by almost that much. So that's big. Okay? But it's nothing like what we see in the Confederacy, where real wages are falling to about 1/10 of what they had been at the beginning of the war. And people are, on the brink of starvation, etc. They are really bad off in the Confederacy.